Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past, what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
Welcome to Dis Affamie History Podcast with your host, Wendy Aris. In this episode, they delve into a remarkable yet often overlooked chapter of Atlantic world history with Matthew Taylor, author of Black Redcoats, The Corps of Colonial Marines, 1814 to 1816. Together, they explore the lives of formerly enslaved men who joined the British Colonial Marines during the War of 1812, men who transformed military service into a pathway toward freedom, land, and community. This conversation examines Black resistance, mobility, and self-determination, as well as the legacies these soldiers left behind in places like Trinidad, Nova Scotia, and beyond. Their stories challenge narrow narratives of enslavement by centering agency, strategy, and survival. Join Wendy and Matthew as they discuss how the Black Redcoats reshaped ideas of freedom, citizenship, and belonging in the age of empire, and why their history still matters today. So let's have a listen and enjoy the episode.
I just wanted to thank you, Matt Taylor, for coming on to the podcast, Dis Affamie History, and to talk about your book, Black Redcoats, the Corps of the Colonial Marines from 1814 to 1816. And before we start, can I just have you just do a brief introduction of yourself?
Hey, sure thing. Well, I say my name's Matthew Taylor. I mean, I'm a weird fish these days. I jokingly say that I set out to be a military historian and accidentally became a Black historian on the way. Because, as we'll probably get into, I wrote this book as a bit of a labour of love, having discovered the unit as snippets in other pieces of work. And the joke I make is that these days, if you're a military historian, when you find something out, you nip on Amazon and you buy the book about it, because there's always books about everything nowadays. And there wasn't a book about these gentlemen. And after doing a bit of digging and research, the lack of the book really outraged me, which is why I ended up writing it, if you see what I mean. And so, yeah, I've kind of wandered into this world accidentally.
No, sometimes these stories find us, but no, thank you so much, Matt. And, who were the Colonial Marines and why were they formed? And for the listeners that, are unfamiliar with this history, can you just explain the origins of this Black military corps?
Sure thing. Well, what happened was in 1812, when the British Empire is involved in a global war against Napoleonic France. In the middle of that war in 1812, the United States suddenly attacked British Canada, or what would become Canada. There's various reasons for that. We don't need to go into too hard, though I'll just shout very loudly, it was all their fault, bloody Americans. But because the British Empire is involved in this huge global war against Napoleon, this new front in an entirely new continent in North America was the last thing the British Empire needed. And the British Empire had very limited means to defend Canada or strike back. And by luck alone, really, the American attempt to attack Canada was very poor. And the Canadians, with great courage but incredibly limited resources, managed to hold the Americans off. But the British government needed to strike back against America to try and dissuade them from continuing the war. And the way the empire did this was we're a maritime empire, so we have a massive fleet. So we put together a task force of ships to attack the Chesapeake Bay, which is where Virginia and Maryland are, and where Washington D.C. and Baltimore are. And the idea is it's a punitive campaign, a terror campaign. We're going to send a fleet into a safe part of America, a place far away from any risk, and we're going to attack it to demonstrate to the American people that you've got yourself in a fight with a big boy and you shouldn't have done that. The problem is is we're very limited in our resources. So the task force is quite small, really, only a couple of thousand men available to actually attack coasts. And the United States is large. So when you land troops on the coast, you have the American War of Independence problem, which is that before you know it, you lost the enemy, who are local, militia based and all that. They're just outmaneuvering you with their local knowledge, and they're hurting you bad. But after these British attacks began, completely unexpectedly from the British perspective, as in I can find zero reference to this until it happens. Enslaved African Americans in Virginia and Maryland, they escape slavery and come to the British forces, the British landing groups, and some of them steal boats and row out to British ships, and they say, "I will work for you if you'll take me away." And there's lots of reasons for this. The most approximate reason is only 30 or so years before, in the American War of Independence, thousands of African Americans had been liberated by British forces on condition of service. So it was a way of undermining the Patriots. We would say, if you're enslaved by a rebel against the crown and you fight for the crown, we'll give you freedom. That's where the Black loyalist community of Canada largely comes from today. Yeah. So that's still kind of in living memory. There was also frequently in the decades before the war began, you'd have the odd situation where an enslaved person would escape from American captivity onto British ships and get away. So I think within African American culture in the United States, which was still very much an East Coast nation at the time, there was an understanding that although the British Empire itself was a slave-holding empire, there was a slightly differential relationship, a perhaps less racially stratified relationship between the Brits and slavery. Mm-hmm. And again, there was certainly not ignorance of the conditions of British slavery. Lots of African Americans may well have been initially in British hands in Jamaica or the Bahamas or whatever, and then sold into the American market. So there wasn't like an ignorance gap, which meant people imagined that Britain was somehow better. But there was definitely an understanding there was a gradient difference between white Americans and white Britons, if you see it, even though culturally we're actually very similar. But these African Americans, when they came to British forces, they bring, I'm going to use lots of military studies nerd terminology. They bring granular intelligence to British forces. So where once upon a time we're getting lost in the dark and we're bumbling around the countryside, formerly enslaved African Americans, they're now providing us direct targeted information. In order to maintain our raiding, we need to keep the fleet supplied, we need to keep everyone fed, everyone watered and all this. We've went from bumbling around American towns to formerly enslaved people, direct British forces to, the cupboards in people's houses, the hidey holes that people are making and things like this. And the American way of defending themselves in this era is the militia idea. It's the idea that every free man grabs his gun out of the closet and goes out to defend the town. What we found was that the escapes by enslaved people to British forces induced a fear of a widespread slave uprising, which meant that the American military commander's ability to say, right, everyone, grab your guns, let's all get together and go out and fight the Brits, that dissipates because people are afraid to leave their homes for fear of enslaved people escaping or rising up in their absence and things like this. And after a couple of months of this, the British commanders in the Chesapeake Bay, a guy called Cochrane and a guy called Coburn, they decide that this is becoming such an immense advantage to British forces because we're getting dozens of people every day fleeing to our forces. They say what we need to do is we need to operationalize this. So instead of just taking in these refugees as they became known, if you ever want to find them in historical records, they're usually referred to as the Black refugees. Rather than just taking these refugees and taking the information and maybe using them as guides, what we'll do is we'll take those willing to volunteer to fight, and we will form them into a uniformed part of the British military establishment. In this case, we call them the Colonial Marines. We put them under the command of the Royal Marines of the Expeditionary Force. We uniform and equip them as Royal Marines. And the idea is they're simultaneously they're a striking power increase because the landing force is now gaining men. Normally forces dissipate in operations, but people are coming to us, so we're actually growing in strength. And the propaganda and terror factor of meshing the ever-present fear of an enslaved uprising with the idea that the enslaved are actively being part of a foreign military assault smashes American morale, and that's the concept. And they're not wrong, not wrong. But as soon as red-coated colonial marines join British military operations, American resistance in the Chesapeake, Virginia, and Maryland, it starts to crumble, and you can feel the panic. You read American newspapers, American reports. It's all very heavily racialized. It's all like, this is Haiti, and Haiti in the American imagination is this terrible ethnic cleansing of white people, which wasn't actually true, but throughout most American 19th century history, that's what it was conceived as. And you can feel that this great combination of outrage that a fellow white civilization would release this savagery, while also not direct reflection, but nearly direct reflection of, oh God, because we're a slave society, our enemies are all around us at all times. So like the hypocrisy of a slave society, the idea of the loyal slave is suddenly brought to light. If everyone recognize that none of these enslaved people have any loyalty to us. Why would they? If you see what I mean. And now there's an alternative force out there.
Yeah, exactly. And then I know you kind of alluded to, but what was happening globally during that time frame period of 1814, 1860 that really shaped Britain's decision to recruit the formerly enslaved Africans?
In 18, I say our operations began in 1813, and the unit was formed in 1840. But there's really only a couple of months between the two events.
Okay.
The big factor I think that's crucial here is the war against Napoleon is in kind of its final massive global war phases. So all kind of British attention is on that, and dealing with the American attack in Canada is a secondary matter. And attacking the United States in the Chesapeake Bay is a secondary matter of a secondary matter, because defending Canada's the real aim. Attacking American coast is a further operation. And I think that created kind of a space where the commanders on the ground, Cochrane and Cockburn, they had a mission, which was to hurt the United States. They had very limited resources. And so they decided to operationalize the escapees from slavery to increase our striking power. But because all of like central government London focuses on Europe, no one questions it in a real way. They're not under the microscope. Someone doesn't rock up and go, "What about our plantations on Jamaica?" That kind of thing doesn't happen. I think because they existed in this little pocket where they're so far down the pecking order of British interests at this point that they're able to make this call in and of themselves, and just work with it. Whereas again, the line I often joke about here is like, it would be so easy to turn this story into, oh God, the benevolent Brits rock in, rule Britannia in, and liberate people. But you have to recognize that while we did rock in, rule Britannia in, and all that, the force that did this was kind of outside of everyday oversight. So was making calls that might have actually caused worry further up the British command chain if the focus was there.
Okay. And then why did, enslaved Africans choose to join the British? Was it just strictly for freedom, or were there additional political or cultural or survival reasons why they joined?
And in the vast majority of cases entirely freedom-based. There's an interesting, exciting element of kind of people instantly grabbing their agency here. The second enslaved people come to British forces. Like the first bunch I found was, I think, 7 or 8 guys who got on board HMS Victorious, having rowed out. They said, "We'll do what you want if you take us away to freedom" at the end. And they ended up working on HMS Victorious for like 9 months and eventually debarking in Halifax in Nova Scotia. So, and it all seems to be about take us away to somewhere else where we can be free. And there was certainly, like in individual cases, there was interesting interesting, and sometimes, obviously, because this is a terrible era of history, sometimes quite harrowing stuff about people escaping from terrible masters and saying that he was just a sadist monster. I had to get out of there. But you also get, I mean, again, one of the joys of this story is that there's really amazing kind of granular stories. Like a good one I can give you is there was an enslaved chap. He was called Southey by his slave owner. He escaped slavery to British forces, and he changed his name in British forces to John Floyd. But the slave owner was called John K. Floyd. And thanks to, again, this is like part of the joy, like the archaeology of this is so fun. When John K. Floyd reported the escape of Southey to like a local government official, for no reason whatsoever, the local government official noted down some physical attributes next to his name, which included that he was yellow-skinned, which is a very old-fashioned one for mixed race. Yeah. So just from putting those together, it's pretty clear, I think, that Southey was probably John K. Floyd's son. So you got again this beautiful agency story of a man who has been given this diminutive pet name of Southey, escaping enslavement, taking the name of almost certainly his biological father, like from his biological father, and then the crazed part of this story is that John K. Floyd, he came to British forces under flag of truce and asked for Southey back, and British forces said no, and John Floyd, as he now was, didn't return. So and again, I like that story because it's such an amazing kind of like, it's such a vision. Like when I'm talking to majority white audiences, which is my primary audience here in the United Kingdom, I always say, it's such an amazing insight into, many of us in this room might have kids. Can you imagine being the kind of man who would father a child in that way, and then imagine his ownership rights over it as somehow a connection? If you see what I mean, it's great. It grabs the visceralness and makes people reflect in a way I really love. But the other aspect of why people fled to the British in this story is another really cool one, which is, generally speaking, in the history of escaping from enslavement, it's a young man's game. You have to be fit. You have to be fit. You have to be relatively self-contained. You've got miles to go. You've got to be mobile. You've got to be elusive. It's hard to do in a family group with kids. It's hard to do if you're old. In this situation, because you've got a British expeditionary fleet like sat just offshore, and the British force ends up occupying an island called Tangier, which is still there in the Chesapeake Bay, and making it a base area. What you find is that entire families are escaping slavery. And in many cases, there's an obvious structure where a young man escapes to the British forces on his own, becomes a colonial marine, and then I haven't found anything written, but it happens so often that I'm convinced it became a kind of quid pro quo. Well, if you, as a young enslaved, formerly enslaved man, were like, I will take a gun, I will submit to military discipline, I will submit to military command, and add to your military power, British forces. The British forces were like, well, we'll go and get your family with you then. And so you get beautiful, amazing stories of like young men returning, like you're not escaping in the night. You're coming back with a military force in tow, holding up your former slave owner by bayonet point, getting your kids and your wife and your parents out and all this kind of thing. And I think that's another factor, is this isn't just a case of furtive individual escapes. This is a window where it's everybody you know and love can make it out. So it creates a kind of snowball effect, if you see what I mean. The best example, again, when I was digging through the records, I found enslaved people well into their 60s and early 70s who make it out in this wave, and tiny children, including one tragic case, a woman handed her baby to British forces, but she herself didn't escape for reasons that are unclear, if you see what I mean. And again, I think it's a good example of, in the American context, and to a lesser extent in the Caribbean context, because the society is essentially all pervasively a slave society, there's no exit route. In the United States, you have to escape from a slave state, make it to a free state, and hope that people in the free state won't happily bag you up for the reward, if you see what I mean. Mm-hmm. In the Caribbean context, you can escape into the hills and the mountains, but you're in a defined area cut off by sea. So there's only so many refuges. in this scenario, it's a full exit ramp for people. If you know what I mean, you will leave the society that is enslaving you and move to an entirely different society, and it can happen really quickly because it's you just go to the Brits who are setting fire to the next town over, or you row out to the boat that's offshore, and you get an interesting one where British forces deliberately induce this. British ships light themselves up at night with lanterns in the masts and have bands playing all night, so you can hear where the escape route is.
Yes.
Yeah. You also get an interesting example of agency comes out in that slave owners like reporting into like local newspapers and stuff, report things like, and it's interesting again, how the power dynamics shift when somebody else is present. You get slave owners reporting that they were spying on their slaves and listening to their slaves making plans to escape en masse. And you think, well, you're the slave owner. You're meant to be this like totalitarian figure. Why don't you intervene? And it's because, of course, there's only a dozen white people on this farm and there's 60 plus enslaved black people. And the power dynamic is entirely changed because you can't guarantee that anyone from the surrounding area will come and help you now, because they're all they're all busy watching their own slaves with more intensity because of the fear of escape. So again, again, you can. One of the kind of like jokey comments you can make about this is that the United States as a culture was lucky to never go to war with like a peer competitor nation while it had slaves, because enslaved people are such an obvious fifth column for any foreign attacker. And it's interesting that no major expansionist wars against other nations took place until after the end of slavery. Yeah. And I wonder if if not overtly in their brains, but that was always kind of a factor in American minds that actually, no, I mean, if a Spanish fleet rolled into South Carolina, there'd be a lot of people willing to help, if you see what I mean.
Exactly. And, we'll go into the enlistment experience of the Black Colonial Marines. Like, was their training different? Were their roles, uniform, of course, treatment? How did this differ from the regular British forces?
Well, there's an interesting aspect here. The first aspect is that joining the British military forces as a colonial marine or joining the Navy as a sailor wasn't a requirement to be taken away to freedom. The British offer that was put out by the Admiral in charge, Cochrane, was actually a blank check. It just says, come to us and we'll take you away for freedom. And you can serve in the forces if you want. That was an interesting construction, if you know what I mean. A lot of people like overtly said that. It's like, I'm here to be taken away. I'm not here to fight for you, which is again another example of agency and the understanding of that contractual relationship. This is what you said. I'm holding you to it. But the men who became colonial marines are interesting in the context of British military culture at the time, because this is the era of impressment. So if I was in the wrong pub in a seaside town, some Navy guys rock in, beat me up, and I wake up on a warship and I'm in the Navy now. If I burgle someone's house in Lancashire, the magistrates stick me in the army rather than put me in prison. So this all volunteer force of escapees from slavery are actually at a higher motivational level than the British forces around them. They've escaped from the depravity of slavery and are willingly signing up to fight against it with all the risk that entails. If you see what I mean. So again, they're ironically, you might think, at a much greater kind of loyalty to British aims than even the average British sailor or soldier. And you can perhaps detect in that I think I've established that it took about a month for a colonial marine to sign the dotted line and see combat. And because we're in kind of an active war zone here at a forward operating base in Tangier Island, you can basically assume that month was wall-to-wall training under various Royal Marine commanders. And again, the nature of the warfare here isn't that kind of a set piece, massive Napoleonic walls of men moving in metronomic movement at all. This is a much more kind of modern war of small numbers of men moving with lots of personal initiative. And the African Americans, they already know the ground better than the British forces they're supporting. So they're already at a higher capacity than the British forces they're supporting. So a month of training, just making sure they're good at their guns and know what the orders are is pretty much all you need. But in terms of their treatment, it was identical to the Royal Marines they were now part of. So pay was the same. You got your signing up bounty, like a signing up bonus if you decided to do it, which was cash in hand. You got the same rations, including the famous rum ration, so alcohol. And there was one genuinely interesting deviation, which is that in British military discipline, flogging was common in both Navy and in Army. The Colonial Marines were explicitly exempt from that. They could not be flogged. And that's just a statement made in orders. There's no explanation. I think the explanation is obvious, that it's too similar to the kind of punishment one would suffer under slavery. But it means that there would have been, there's still full punishment books for the expeditionary force. So you have to imagine a scenario where a young man who grew up in American slavery becomes a British soldier and a Marine. And one of Marine's jobs on ship is to form kind of a guard while sailors are being punished. So you have to imagine, again, at these formerly enslaved people would have stood there on deck watching white soldiers and white sailors be flogged for their misdemeanors as servicemen. So, which must have, again, when we talk about the motivation factors, actors like, because I talked about this to a lovely bunch of British military officers recently. It's like, in the military world, we all talk a lot about the transformational aspect of being a serviceman. The idea that you become something bigger than yourself. You become part of a tradition that is ancient, depending on the regiment you join, and it allows you to transfer whoever you were as a person into this bigger thing. And like, again, the step change between the kind of enclosed life of an enslaved person to then attach to that and become part of that. Mind-boggling intensity. The vista of the world that opens out in front of you must have been incredible, and it's no wonder they fought as hard as they did.
Yeah. And so how did the British justify the recruitment of enslaved Africans politically and morally?
This is interesting. We're going to get really macro and meta here now. Now, at the core, there is an urgent military need, which is that the military forces we've got available to us constrained because we're the British forces in the Chesapeake, we're a sideshow of a sideshow, so we're well down the list, so we're not getting reinforcements. So you need to increase military capacity to complete the mission. So you've got to take the resources that are available to you, and if these people are escaping enslavement and they're willing to fight. So first instance, pure military need. On a wider level, and this comes up later in the story, when the discussions happen about what do we do with the black refugees. The British Empire was always racially defined, but it was never so ridiculously stratified as to be like, people who look like that can't have X or Y. It'd always be flexible to local need. So although the British Empire is a slave-holding empire, there isn't like a hard definition between black slaves and white free people, because white Britons aren't free either, because we're not a republic that talks about freedom for everyone. We're a quasi-democratic oligarchical aristocracy, if you know what so there's graduations between everybody. And that, I think, mentally meant that British officers could go, oh yeah, enslaved people in Jamaica, that's them. But these people, they're free. And they didn't really feel a disconnect. They didn't draw a line between the two and say the racial solidarity between the two means we can't trust one over the other. The most giveaway line I could find about this is one British governor of an island which eventually took in a load of these people as free people. He heard a complaint from plantation owners who said, this is mad. You're bringing military trained black people into the island, and we're all slave owners. And he says, but you have to remember, these are all going to be free farmers. If we have a revolutionary uprising of enslaved people, it's their property on the line as well. So they'll be on the side of the state to defend what they've got against the revolutionary uprising. And that thing is my favorite kind of like glimpse into it's a pre-scientific racism world if you see what I mean, where
Mhm.
where you don't immediately ascribe skin color as the primary identifier. It's
Exactly. They're just using something else to be able to maintain the balance of structure and power.
yeah.
How did American society then perceive and of course react, to armed black soldiers fighting for the British?
Okay. Well, there's two main elements. For the first couple of like weeks or months, you get full scale propaganda mocking. This idea that there was one obviously nonsense story in newspaper about a British officer was witnessed throwing his hands in the air because the formerly enslaved people kept aiming their guns at themselves. You know what I mean? Which is still obviously nonsense. That's a classic kind of thing. You get like a mocking of it, which is part of the diminutization, infantilizing of the enslaved people. You also get an interesting propaganda element where the Americans immediately say, well, clearly the Brits are just taking them away to ship them straight off to their own plantations in Barbados and Jamaica. That this is clear. They're just stealing our labor units to add to their own labor units. This is obviously all it is. Once operations really commence, though, what you get in, again, using kind of over the top military language, is you get a self-induced psychological operation where the American slave society, all slave societies, are precarious security societies where you're constantly afraid of a slave uprising and you never truly know if you've negated the threat because, of course, people's desire for freedom is eternal. So that fear, that constantly kind of background radiation fear of the slave society, like, now turns up to 11 and they go, oh my God, everyone around us is a potential recruit to the enemy. And this induces kind of, in my opinion, kind of a morale collapse in the American culture in the coast of Virginia and the coast of Maryland, where instead of feeling like they're in control, they feel like pockets of white people surrounded by black people in a way that they hadn't previously. And again, that anxiety becomes so domineering that you end up with, as I kind of mentioned before, you end up with an inability to defend themselves because you can't get all the white men in an area together to fight off British attackers. In fact, it's because too many of them are like, oh, I can't leave the farm, if you know what I mean. And we all know how terrible and savage they are, so I can't leave my wife and kids behind, and all this kind of stuff. So all these anxieties that were constantly always present now become so real that everyone is neutralized by it. And again, from my perspective, like as a 21st century person looking back, it's interesting again how like the societal blindness to the essential injustice of what they're doing every day kind of tries to maintain itself through this. It's like, well, I mean, of course, if the British weren't around, it would be fine. Is kind of is kind of the feel. It's like, they'd all be. It's not that enslaved people have a continual desire for freedom. It's that their contentment has been punctured by the presence of the British. If you see what I mean.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then, of course, what were the unique strategies or skills did the Colonial Marines bring to warfare?
Immediately, it's twofold. It's they're local. They're local, so they know the ground, and they're, in some ways, again, an enslaved person who's been on the run has a better knowledge of a local area than a person who just lives there, because if you just live there, you just walk down the road. If you're on the run, you have to find your way through the swamps and the forests and so on. And that information is now transferred directly to the British military. So you do have these interesting examples of American militia commanders saying, we were ambushed by the foreign Brits in our own forest. And it's because British forces are guided by Colonial Marines and other refugee African Americans. So that turns the kind of tactical situation on its head. British forces know better now than the Americans they're fighting. But then on the larger level, the fear factor that the Colonial Marines bring to any fight is, I think, hard to understate, because again, the slave culture has psyoped itself into, oh God, if they get me, they'll tear me apart. If they get into my house, my wife and children will be killed. And that means that you can feel the brittleness of American will to resist when colonial marines are deployed. And there's an interesting observation here that's quite important, I feel, which is that there is an eternal fear of sexual violence by enslaved people. It's two white women. That I can find no credible reference whatsoever to anything like that ever happening on the part of the colonial marines. But there was definitively a time when there was several sexual assaults by British soldiers in one particular operation. After the war ends, that series of sexual assaults in American history is ascribed to colonial marines, even though it really wasn't them. And I think that's an interesting example. They had to, you have to find something to prove something you already think was going to happen. And again, there's all kinds of interesting questions there about, why weren't these men, why didn't they just kill their slave owners when they had them held up? And because, it's the perfect opportunity. And there's multiple factors here. I mean, again, there's only small numbers of you escaping. So, if you start murdering slave owners left, right, and center, it's other enslaved people who are going to take the brunt of that. You're away with the Brits, but it's people still in slavery who are going to suffer. But I also think, again, just from some of the tones of some of the stuff I have been able to find, I do get the impression that a lot of these lads, because again, they're lads, they're teenagers. I think the oldest in the first wave of recruits was only like in his early 30s. I can imagine them just being like, no, I'm not an animal. You think I am, but I'm not. So I'm going to be everything you think I aren't. I'm going to obey orders from this person I voluntarily decided to be under the command of, this white British officer. I'm going to accept your surrender. I'm going to hold you up while we loot and take your house and free other enslaved people. But I'm not going to hurt you because you surrendered, because I'm a real person, not an animal. I get a strong sensation that within the unit, that idea, we have to be the best. We have to be perfect soldiers, because that's a standard that enslavers think we can't be.
No, definitely. And this next question, it kind of alludes to some of what you've said already, but what role did their knowledge of course, the land environment or the plantation system play in their success?
Central. It was central. Again, it's this thing about how no plantation owners and farmers and all this, they're just the managers. The people at the coalface, they know everything about how things actually work, and those people are now on an enemy's side. So it leads just endless advantages to the British forces. I mean, there's numerous notes in British records where people didn't even escape slavery helpers at times. You had situations where enslaved people were, singularly moving around the countryside and ran into British forces and were like, I can't escape because I don't know if I'll be able to get everybody else out. But there is a militia unit massing in this town. So they just constantly, information just constantly leaks out to the British forces because, again, these people who are integral to the societal workings have no loyalty to it, if you see what I mean. And again, it leads into things that, by the end of the war, liberation of slaves has become so common as a British strategy that enslavers start doing things like they start moving slaves inland. And in one interesting incident, a British landing force destroyed a farm, looted the farm. No slaves were there, but then out of nowhere, someone appears and says they're not here because they've all been dragged into a nearby wood and chained to the trees in the wood, so they can't escape. And the British force goes and finds all the people and releases them. And again, it shows the level that people, that the slave owners had to go to secure themselves. But yeah, again, it's this thing about how it's this idea that the enslaved person in Virginia and Maryland, they're not a cart horse. They're an integral part of the society at every level.
Mm-hmm.
And that means, and when given the ability to damage that society by a hostile force, they're touching every button, if you know what I mean. Again, to use another example of like the granularity of all this, there was an enslaved woman, Elizabeth, I think her name was. She escaped from slavery. Joined British forces. Non-combatants like women and children could often take roles like fixing uniforms, cleaning stuff, and things like this. And she came back to the farm she'd been enslaved on with British forces just to get her clothes back, like just to pack a bag, if you know what I mean, which the slave owner thought was insane. Like, you know, his letter is like how outraged he is that she would be so full of herself,
Yeah.
to come and collect her stuff when she doesn't have stuff because she's an enslaved person. If you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm. No, and then of course after the war, where did the Colonial Marines go? Did they go to Nova Scotia, Trinidad, or other parts of the Caribbean?
Well, the black refugees of the Chesapeake area, the vast majority of the non-combatants, those who didn't serve in the British forces, the vast majority of them went to Nova Scotia and Halifax, and you can still find descendant communities in that area, Preston, and the loads of people ended up in Africville, which is now a historical area. There was a community which was tellingly called Refugee Hill, which has since moved, and the name has changed. But a friend of mine at a university in Halifax has done excavations of that community, which is quite fun. But the Colonial Marines themselves, so the red-coated part of the Royal Marines, and that's also an interesting factor, is that by the end of the war, one of the battalions of the Royal Marines had been renamed the 3rd Battalion Royal and Colonial Marines. So they were like an integrated military force with, I think, 3 or 4 companies of white Marines and then 5 or 6 companies of black Marines operating together. But the Colonial Marines, as a military force, they were moved initially to Bermuda, and they were kept as a force on the Island, which is the Royal Navy dockyard in Bermuda. And it's also an interesting here is that while you had the military force of the young men themselves, they also had their attached dependents, so lots of wives and children. In one case, a guy had both his mum and dad there. And they were moved as part of the establishment as well. So that's quite unusual in British military history, to have like the camp followers, so connected that they're physically moved with them. But they were kept as a military force into 1816, which is like a good year after the war against America ended. I think because if treaty negotiations broke down and we went back into it, we wanted to swing the Colonial Marines right back in and start all the same problems again. But when it became clear that a war wasn't going to happen, the Colonial Marines were demobilized as one large group to the island of Trinidad. And this is their most visual and, in my opinion, most cool, sentimentalist and romantic legacy. Is if you go to Trinidad, if you go to Moruga on the south coast, head north a bit, there's a bunch of villages called 5th Company, 4th Company, 6th Company, and so on, which is the companies of Colonial Marines that were settled there as free farmers. And they still exist today. They're a recognized ethnic group in Trinidad and Tobago. The Americans, the Americans. Their identifier giveaway is that they're all kind of Virginia Baptists on an island of Catholics and Anglicans, if you see what I mean. Yeah. But that itself was a kind of incredible payout, if you know what I mean. They were given land grants, and one group was given, because the interior of the island wasn't well known. One group was given a land grant which turned out to be quite bad land, so they were moved to better land. The British government recognised it had a contractual relationship and responded to their complaint that it hadn't been fulfilled by moving them to a further better location for development. And the community in Nova Scotia had a similar kind of contractual relationship with the colonial government, but generally speaking, had to push up against a lot more kind of neglect and indifference. Mm-hmm. Some of it racially tinged, but they were still kind of building their own lives. You could find lots of great like petitions in Nova Scotia where these formerly enslaved people are saying, we were told we'd get what we needed to set our lives up, and you aren't holding it up. And very often you'd find that some of the men who'd been Colonial Marines or been sailors, they're the top signatures to demonstrate that actually, we're not just a bunch of people who've escaped American slavery asking for stuff. We're also led by people who actively served the British state. So there's a relationship that needs to be fulfilled.
Mm-hmm. And of course, What archival sources or repositories were most helpful in writing this book? Were there any surprises that you uncovered?
There's two. There's two big ones, and there was a great surprise. The first major archival source for all of this is because this is a military operation, and the Royal Navy was insanely good at bureaucracy. We have so much written information about the escapees from slavery in the War of 1812 from the Royal Navy side, because every day you're having to produce ship manifests as who's on the ship. That's how you calculate supply usage and things like this. So people appear and you can track them as they move from ship to ship, to shore establishment, to transport, to Nova Scotia in sometimes ridiculously granular and like lovely detail, like the records of people having kids and things like this kind of stuff. It's just there because it's a thing that happened on ship, and you have to record everything. And that kind of corpus is genuinely wonderful, because even though again it's from kind of the top down, it's from the white British officer class who are a breed apart from the white working class who operate in themselves, never mind these formerly enslaved people. It's still an interesting kind of glimpse into the world. Well, the second major archival source is that for 10 years after the end of the war, between 1815 and 1825, the United States government harried the British government that enslaved people who left in the War of 1812 were stolen property, and that the British government owed compensation for them as property. And that meant that after lots of wrangling, I say it took a good 10 years. In 1825, there was an Anglo-American commission. People slave owners who said they'd lost slaves in the War of 1812 could provide evidence to the commission, affidavits, signed witness statements about how many people had escaped, who had escaped to British forces, and that would gain them a compensation payout paid by the British government. And this means that in trying to prove that Tom, Dick, or Harry escaped slavery, the enslavers provide insanely brilliant depictions of people's life, which would not exist in any other scenario. In order to back up their claim, they're providing very, all the way down to, notes on their personality and things like this, stuff like, because I knew this man, and he definitely, and that again, at times it's incredibly revealing. What one slave owner said, because he didn't write it himself, someone transcribed him for him, so he's talking to a notary who's noting it down for him, and at one point, he says, I don't know how old this guy is, because, we don't really bother recording when people are born. We only take note when they're old enough to work. And anyway, we work them so hard, they look older than they are.
Yeah.
And it was just such a kind of just a throwaway kind of, it's such a great glimpse into there. Now, you know what world is you're presiding over, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And all this information is eventually bundled up, and the joke I make is that you have to. It's kind of ironic. You have a situation where the liberating force, in this case the British Empire, our lawyers are saying, "Well, you can't prove we liberated that person. We're not going to pay out." So we're actively talking down the number of people who were liberated, while the enslaving force, in this case the United States, they're actively trying to push up the number of people who found it so intolerable that they left, if you see what I mean. So there's an interesting and awkward tension there. As a random and again weird aside, and people at the time thought this was weird. The English-speaking Republic, the United States, and the English-speaking Empire, the British Empire, we mediated all this via the Tsar of Russia. So all these records had to be translated into Russian for transfer to the Tsar so he could give his final judgment on them, which is an interesting call. But that information, as I say, at like state level, in the Library of Congress's State Papers Archive, there's just a list of every single enslaved person who compensation was paid out for by name, which is it's again brilliant, if you know what I mean. Just because it's got the people who are claiming, which is sometimes the executions of people's wills because so long has passed. But then you've got lists of people and where they're from, and you can cross-reference that with the affidavits and the local information. Big shout out to American local history museums. Like in Maryland, there's a museum called the Bayside History Museum. They've transcribed, I think, every single slave compensation demand from local white people, like online on their art. It's incredible. These incredible like looks into the lives of people, and that's led on to kind of what I think of as the surprise.
Yeah.
The surprise was there was an enslaved person called William Dear who was in Maryland, right? And he escaped from his slave owner and became a colonial marine. And by accident, a white American civilian was nearby when he requested from a British officer to drop out of today's military operation because he wanted to go and rescue his wife. And this American civilian just happened to be there, and he noted it down as part of a compensation, like witness statement. Said, "Oh yeah. You know, the British officer initially forgot that that Mr. Dear had been given permission to leave, and he was, oh yes, you're that guy. Off you go. There you go." So you had that interesting glimpse of, again, agency, the idea that these men were kind of negotiating with their British commanders, like, yeah, you know, I want to go and get my wife who's still in slavery. And the British officers go, well, that makes perfect sense. You drop out of the operation when you'd think the military need would be paramount. But then, off the back of that, in Halifax, in Nova Scotia, in like 1830 something, an American from New York traveled through the region, and he wrote a really lovely kind of travelogue of traveling around Canada. And he meets William and Nancy Dear because they run a pub called the Stag, and the Dears run a stag, which is great. And he has a conversation with them, which he records in his travelogue, and he's ignorant of all the facts, while we as historians looking back, we've got the full context, which makes it amazing, because with a weird kind of lack of tact, he essentially says to Nancy and William, you know, don't you kind of regret leaving slavery because life's so hard here in Canada? You know, this is a really hard scrabble life running this tavern. And Nancy Dear, she tells him this story about how she escaped from slavery so quickly that William had to come after her, like and by accident, that travel writer captured a moment of beautiful marital teasing, because we know that William escaped and went back for her. So for her to then kind of tease him and go, oh yeah, I got out of there so quick, he had to come after me. You know, they're joking in front of this unaware visitor about this amazing kind of romantic moment. Yeah, again, you know, the kind of man who would go back and get them out and then live 40 years with them and have, you know, tons of kids as well they deserve. And then, from putting all that together, I was digging around in Nova Scotia online archive stuff, and in Nova Scotia Museum, I think in storage right now, they've got the pub sign from the Stag, which is a like a rhyme about, you know, weary travellers can come in and get some ginger beer from William Dear, if you know what I mean. And then it ends again. I love it because it hammers, like, again, this is a romantic story. The final line is, you know, William Dear and his dearest Dear will endeavour to serve you. And it's like, Jesus God, yeah. Again, that couple, Nancy and William Dear, that's, again, that's a love for the ages. And I felt incredibly privileged kind of reconstructing it from all these sources. And, like, you know, and feeling the depth of feeling and the love, the multi-decade long love through enslavement, escape, and building a new life, if you see what I mean. And that was moving. I mean, I'm almost in tears now, you know.
No, absolutely. No, and it's powerful to know that, you know, they were able to leave out of bondage and kind of have their own power and freedom in another country. But, and I guess to further go on to that, you know, how did or what did the, you know, the service of colonial marines tell us really about the Black agency during the age of emancipation?
Well, again, I think this hammers home the fact that, I mean, to an extent in the American context, but very much in the British imperial context, the binary, the idea there was enslavement and freedom isn't true. There was even while enslavement was active, there was gradations of freedom that people could secure for themselves, be it like maroon communities fighting for their freedom, or people finding privileged positions which gave them greater freedom, or in this case, people escaping an enemy nation's enslavement, and then saying that, well, we're like stakeholders in the British state who we fought for, so it owes us as much as we owe them, and we'll stand up for that right, if you see what I mean. Again, these communities, it's one of those things where like the language of the time kind of makes it a bit like the language of the time is, my lord, as your obedient servant, I only request. But that's all just like cherry topping on the cake. It's just a demand you're making. It's just a demand you're making, if you see what I mean. So, and the agency to do that, it becomes instantaneous. I mean, again, another example is how quick it happens is that while the war was still ongoing, some of the refugee women and children from Virginia and Maryland, they ended up on Bermuda in the Royal Navy dockyard, kind of in a holding pattern, like we don't know what we're going to do with them yet. And they're told to work in the dockyard, and they refuse to until conditions of pay are sorted out. And as a group, they like collectively say, we're not going to do anything until we're not going to do it. We're not going to just do make work. That's one interesting thing as well. They say, we're not just going to do nonsense for you. We need to do real stuff, and we want to be paid for it. So like, there's an instantaneous connection between we're now in a state of freedom, which means our labor is worth something, and we must demand it. Right, and there's actually that leads to quite a charming moment where the British military commander of them, that garrison, he writes back to one of the theatre commanders and says, "You've got to stop sending people because they're causing me so much havoc with these kind of demands. It's getting a bit out of control. With obviously kind of with a very kind of racialized stand of I'm not used to having to deal with people like this." And the theatre commander, Colburn it was, writes back and goes, "You need to pack that in, mate. You're lucky to be part of the liberating force in these people's lives. So sort them out. So look after them." And again, that shows within the British military establishment involved in this operation, I can detect, as a white Briton from the modern era, I can detect how people are going, "Oh God, this is really cool, isn't it? We're liberators." There is an completely tangible moral dimension to our fighting now, which motivates them to do it more. See what I mean? A great example of that I can give is, again, shows how kind of weird these things are. The War of 1812 ended quite suddenly. It ended very famously in a treaty where basically nothing changed. We all went back to how it was. We were all terribly embarrassed this war had happened. That was kind of the tone that both sides decided was appropriate. British forces in the Chesapeake still there. They liberated some enslaved people unknowingly after peace had technically begun. And the slave owner came out to the ship and said, "I've got a newspaper. We've been at peace for 3 days. You have to give them back because that's just robbery now because we're not at war." And the commander of the ship, it was HMS Havana. He sent him away, but he wrote a letter to his overall commander and says, "Please tell me what to do with these people because technically we liberated them outside of the war. But I'd like you to know that my entire crew has said they'll put their hands in their pockets and give all the ready cash on the ship to the slave owner rather than give these people back." Which again thinks it shows like a level how the British forces themselves fully internalize that this is something really good we're doing. And as a random aside, out of the a dozen or so people who were liberated in that raid, we did right because 2 of them were a Mr. and Mrs. Hall, and they went on in Canada to give birth to Frederick Hall, who was the first black man to win the Victoria Cross.
And I guess this just leads into, my next question in terms of what were the lived experiences of the women and children connected to the Marines?
It's an interesting one very much because what you seem to find is there's lots of great work on camp followers in Napoleonic militaries, and the formerly enslaved women and children who came along with Colonial Marines or were liberated subsequently by Colonial Marines. they seem to have synced into that role. Again, they've kind of slotted into a pre-existing understanding of this is what an army on campaign is like. So the women and children were often put into a supernumerary role. So, you find them running laundries on Tangier Island, doing minor fix-it work and things like this. And within that, I think, again, you find them, particularly the women, like renegotiating their own agency because they've escaped, the brutally heteronormative world of enslavement into a world into a world of freedom. But of course, it's still it's a misogynistic era, if you know what I mean, where women are regarded. But you can feel you can feel in the sources a level again of, well, I can define myself now. So you have the women leading this strike essentially on Bermuda. We're not unwilling to work, but willing to do actual work for actual pay. It's a great indication of their understanding of a self value, if you know what I mean. And jumping back to Nancy Deer, when Nancy was talking with this American travel writer, when he's talking, when he's having this kind of, when he's wanging on about wasn't slavery better for you, she makes kind of a joke about how, when she was enslaved, she had like an easy job, like a privileged job, which wasn't as hard as her life running this pub. But then she nails him with, but here in Canada, I work for myself. And again, it's not like I work for my family or I work for my husband. It's I work for myself. And so it suggests again a kind of grabbing of a self-actualization, again transformative in the same way when I was getting all romantic about the transference of a young man into a soldier, the transference of a woman who's had to deal with all the heaped indignities of enslaved life. That the borders of acceptable behavior are much wider for them instantly. They're like, no, I won't allow myself to be put as far back into the box, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And then, of course, how does this story, misunderstood or misrepresented in traditional military history?
Well, there's two major factors to it. In American military history, escapees from slavery, providing aid to the enemy, instantly discounted as a factor. You can sense that. If it's one of the great hypocrisies of slavery, you can sense the idea that they're like traitors, but they're not traitors because they're property. And if we imply they're meant to have loyalty to us, it suggests they're more human than we do in other scenarios, if you see what I mean. So they instantly kind of discount them. And I think that's also partially because you don't want to shake the slave society's idea, which relies on the idea that that these people are lesser and therefore aren't as much of a threat. So you never want to ascribe strength to them. So in American military history, they become dupes, like people who just, people who were lied to by the British, they were promised happy, fulfilled lives of freedom. And and American propaganda about return to slavery often pops up a lot. People say, well, surely the British just returned them to slavery, right? It's like, no, but that rolls on for a long time. And in British military history, partially just because British military history, again, is very, very Eurocentric because it's led by an aristocratic white officer class, the impact of the Colonial Marines on the War of 1812 rapidly disappears from British recollection, like very, very quickly. And that's despite the fact that when you go back and you read all these reports, it's glowing. It's our operations are only possible because of the intelligence of enslaved people. They're only possible because of the direct military aid. They're only possible because of the fear factor and all this. But all that gets kind of packaged up, and the British military story about the War of 1812 becomes the Americans started a war with us when they thought we were on the back foot because we were fighting Napoleon. We sent in our big scary army that had been fighting Napoleon, burnt down their capital city and showed them what for. And we just it just becomes like kind of packaged up like that. And so the impact of the escapees from slavery is discounted there as well. The central thesis of my book is that you can't explain British successes in the War of 1812 without understanding the operationalizing of the desire for freedom of the African American population. And that leads on to kind of one of my kind of like deliberately provocative lines where I say that the burning of Washington, D.C., the only time Washington, D.C. was ever captured by an invader and destroyed, in my opinion, was the apex of the largest and most successful slave uprising in American history. But because it happened under a British flag, that it was a foreign war thing. It wasn't anything to do with the structural weakness that slavery represents to the American structure. And again, I say the most successful uprising with deliberate intent, because between the end of the War of Independence and the end of American slavery itself in 1865, this is the largest successful liberation of enslaved African Americans, 5,000 to 6,000 people. Not many in the grand scheme of things, but more than any other time made it out under this war. And because it happened in the war, it disappears from kind of the story of emancipation, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, what myths about the British Empire in terms of freedom and, of course, slavery does this book challenge?
Well, again, I think I'd argue that in so much as it is a myth, but it's also just it was a kind of standard thinking for a lot of time. We're moving for maybe 10 or so years now into a much more nuanced understanding of imperial history in the British context. Where we're deconstructing kind of the binary idea that all black people were enslaved, all white people were part of the master class. We're deconstructing that bit by bit, and we're also beginning to recognize more that African-derived people, not just people who were enslaved, but any African-derived people in the imperial space who found different ways of living, potentially privileged ways of living within the imperial system. They were grasping their own agency as much as anybody else. It's not a black versus white liberation story. There is a gradation between the two, where these communities, the Maroons on Jamaica, my colonial Marines, and so on, finding their own free places within the system is evidence that the system itself, again, it wasn't so stratified as to not allow this to happen. And that leads on also it leads on like direct connections with the early Georgian black population of places like London now, and how they were able to live as part of, broadly speaking, part of the white working class, or in some cases, part of the white middle class for certain successful people. And I like that, because it sounds really kind of sentimentalist, but talking about black history to a black audience can feel like just hitting people with, anyway, your history was all horror. It was so bad. And then how are people meant to engage with that? How are people meant to grab anything in that? But the ability to then say these stories of people who live their own lives in admittedly massively unequal and at times very sinister societies, but it gives you something else emotionally to hope to hang on to and say, yes, there was lots of horror, but it wasn't entirely horror. And the things that were in some cases good can tell us much more about people's lives and how they maintain themselves and their cultures and their understandings of themselves in the world.
No, exactly. And then I guess this just leads to my next question of, what would you say to descendants who are now probably just discovering this history, either through family research or through DNA?
Well, in this particular one, like if you're a Nova Scotian, modern Nova Scotian, or a Trinidadian, and you're connected to the Americans, or you find out you're connected to the black refugee wave, again, your history is part of the largest self-emancipation in North American history, between the end of the slave trade and the end of British slavery in 1834. And the people who did this, they did it by their own agency in total. British forces didn't come in and say, "Come to us, we'll give you freedom." British forces arrived with a completely military mission that had no aspect about the enslaved when it was enslaved people themselves who, again, going back to the first group I've definitively identified, those 7 or 8 men, they grasped their own courage. they took a leap into the unknown to go to that British ship and say, give me something and I'll give you something, which goes against everything about how slave societies would have treated those men. And fortuitously, it might not necessarily have happened this way, but fortuitously, British forces agreed to that, and it opened a window in which thousands of other people grasped that agency as well. And again, it's simultaneously evidence of the ever presence of the desire for freedom and control of your own life, no matter how long you're in slavery, no matter how many generations you're in, it never goes away.
Mm-hmm.
And the moment it is seized, it becomes self-defining. I work for myself now, and the dignity of that instantly becomes part of the person. And to be a descendant of that, I think is to put you in a lovely kind of a lovely category of the story of not putting up with the situation now and wanting better.
Mm-hmm.
Goes back centuries in your ancestry, if you see what I mean. It was people. If you ever feel you got a mountain to climb, just think about the mountain they climbed, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And then, and again, just for the broader audience, what lessons should Black communities take away from this story of the Black Redcoats?
Well, again, speaking as myself, with self, a white British working class man, it's the black communities who have an attachment to the history of Britain, so Afro-Caribbean, be it communities in the Caribbean, West Africans, East Africans, and so on. The connection to British history brought about by imperialism might have been involuntary in some cases, or the vast majority of cases, I should say. But in some cases, it wasn't. And in both cases, there is a contractual connection between us, between you and Britain-derived societies across the world. That is intrinsic. You're not alien to it, if you see what I mean. And again, that's quite a political, ideological point. I'll nail my colours to the mast there. I'm part of the belief that one of the weird and fun things about being British is that Britishness isn't an ethnic identity. British is a corporate identity. Anyone can become British because it's a union. It's a union of 4 different countries on the home islands. Never mind all the people who connected to us by imperial history, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And that I think is the aspect is like, if people try and say you are outside of Britishness and British history and connection to British history, the good and the bad. No, your ancestors had an agency and an ownership which descends down to you today.
Exactly. And Matt, I'll go back to my question of, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, I've been kind of dancing around it a little bit.
Yes.
Again, I'm a sentimentalist and a romantic about my Britishness. I regard myself as a patriot, which is a word that has now, like in the American context, become heavily encrusted with like quite horrible exclusionary racist stuff. But I'm British patriot, and when I found out about these guys, the reason I found out about them was because a number of colonial Marines, they made a stand against American forces where they were eventually wiped out by the Americans. But when the Americans engaged them, they put up the British flag, and they said to the Americans, "We're here because we're subjects of the King of Great Britain."
Mm-hmm.
And in my sentimentalist, romantic world, again, like I said earlier, if you look me in the eyes and say, I share the same loyalty to your king and country as you do. It doesn't matter who you are or where you're from, because you can choose to do that. So those people who died in that engagement, which took place in Florida, a place called Prospect Bluff, which we haven't talked about too deeply, but buy the book, everyone, it's great. When they did that engagement, they died as free colonial Marines, British soldiers, British subjects, and British citizens, as much as I'm a British subject and citizen right now. and the fact that we as Brits don't really remember them because no one's wrote this book. Like that cut me to the core, because this was an example of kind of my admittedly romantic and sentimental conception of my own national identity, and I was angry that people didn't know about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I dug. And the joke I make is this book was easy to write because the drama, the beauty of it is intrinsic to the story. It's like almost like writing a movie, if you know what I mean. It was so easy. Like when you found the story of William and Nancy Dear, and there was a lad called Toby who ended up in London, and John Floyd seizing back his identity from his slave owner dad, and all this stuff. It was too good to not share it with the world, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. No, thank you so much for that, Matt. And, as we come to a close to end this episode, and it's been rather fascinating and it touched on many themes that is part of this region, is what would be your final thoughts? Like, what do you want the listeners to walk away with?
Well, again, I'd say I've got two separate audiences I'm talking to. To a white British audience, I'm saying that the connection, the direct, visceral connection of non-white peoples to the concept of Britishness is ancient and deserves the value and respect of that. Of that, people have fought and served and professed loyalty to the nation that we are now living in, and worked for it. So there's an ownership there that we have to recognize and respect. There's a connection that's as deep as ours. Then to an audience that is primarily Afro-Caribbean, but also Afro-Canadian, and to an extent also African-American, those who are connected to his operations. It's the idea that there is genuine, beautiful heroism in your history, which didn't end in tragedy. It wasn't all beautiful, brave uprisings, and you had to wait for benevolent white people to give you your rights, if you see what I mean. People did rise up and fought and won their own independence in their own terms. And every single example of that is precious and should be kind of core.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you so much, Matt, for coming on to the podcast and discussing your book, The Black Redcoats. And I'll put all that information in the show notes. And again, just wanted to thank you so much for your time for talking about this, as well as to give your experience as well going through researching all this. So thank you so much.
Entirely my pleasure.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.